Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Variable Operations Maintenance Cost Review Working Group. This is for storage resources. My name is Christina Osborne. I work in Stakeholder Affairs. I'm going to be facilitating the web conference. There are a number of ISO representatives in the room. We have some folks from DMM, from Market Validation, as well as the policy team. So I'll go ahead and have them introduce themselves.
Hi, this is Shruti Hariharan from Market Validation.
Jimmy Bashara, Stakeholder Affairs.
Guillermo Bautista, Market Analysis and Forecasting.
Jenny Sage, Market Validation.
Kevin Head, Market Analysis and Forecasting.
Jess Kuna, DMM.
Adam Swadley, DMM.
Eric Kim with Infrastructure Regulatory Policy.
Gabe Murtaugh, also from Policy.
Great, thank you, everyone. So just so you know, the purpose of this call is really to better understand the operations and maintenance costs that are incurred by the various resources. This is one of 5 working groups where we also held one with gas resources earlier this week. We're going to be holding one with hydro, wind and storage, and then we have another one for kind of the other category, which is geothermal, nuclear, biomass, etc. So those will be, there's a couple on Friday. So you can look on the ISO calendar to get information about those calls. We are going to be recording today's session. We're going to make that recording available out on the Variable Operations and Maintenance Cost Review webpage. That is located on the Stakeholder Processes webpage under the Stay Informed tab on ISO's website. And you'll also find the presentation out there as well as the other materials related to this recurring process. So we did leave the phone lines open. That's so you can ask a question at any time. We ask that you introduce yourself before asking your question. If you're not planning to ask a question or make a comment, please manually mute your phone so we don't encounter any background noise. So with that, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Christina. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Head, Market Engineering Specialist here at the California ISO. For those of you who are on Monday's call about gas resources, some of this will sound familiar. We're holding this call directly in response to some comments that we received from stakeholders about variable operations and maintenance costs of battery and fuel cell resources on a report that we issued late last year. So I'll start by just discussing the high-level purpose of these working groups. The first goal that we have is to offer definitions for comment of a few cost components: major maintenance costs, variable operations costs, not to be confused with variable operations and maintenance cost adder, general and administrative costs as well. And we'd also like to refer stakeholders to the ongoing ESDR, Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources stakeholder process. A little bit of background into why we're conducting this initiative and how we got to this point. We committed to revisit the variable operations and maintenance, or VOM, adders once every 3 years. In December of 2018, we, along with external consultant Nexen, published a report with some updates to these VOM adder values, which have been in place in the market since 2012. Stakeholders noticed a lack of definitions for major maintenance and variable operations and maintenance in our tariff, as well as some other issues. Concerns specifically about batteries, or more broadly NGRs, which are non-generating resources. They were listed as plants without variable and operations and maintenance costs. Move on to a little bit about our current thinking, some of which can be found in a report that we issued along with a market notice a few weeks ago. In looking at the cost adders, we determined that the cost adders are really comprised of multiple cost components. And by discussing the cost components, we can help eliminate some of the gray areas in the process of differentiating between these costs. These cost component terms are general and administrative costs, variable operations costs, major maintenance costs, and other maintenance costs. This other maintenance category or cost component can be split into variable and fixed components. This illustrates visually what I just spoke about. You can see our existing cost adders, which are the major maintenance adder, and the variable operations and maintenance adder, which are used in commitment costs and default energy bids. These are existing concepts in our market. one level lower, you can see the cost components which we're introducing as part of this discussion. Major maintenance adders are comprised of major maintenance costs. The variable operations and maintenance adder is comprised of variable operations costs, which we'll define in a moment, and the variable component of other maintenance costs. You can also see fixed operations and maintenance costs, which are not included in any of our adders, which are comprised of the fixed component of other maintenance costs, as well as some general and administrative costs. So you can see our first goal here, which is offering definitions for stakeholder comment to a few of these terms. So we'll do that now. We'll begin with the low-hanging fruit here, the easier items that are more clear-cut so we can focus on later on. First, we have our general and administrative costs. These are costs that are incurred at plants that do not vary with or relate to production. Think of these as costs such as leasing or rental costs, property taxes, insurance, and industry-related fees and costs. Next, we have variable operations costs. These are costs of consumables associated directly with electrical production and specifically exclude both maintenance and fuel costs. Think of these as consumable materials and supplies. Next, we have major maintenance costs. As I noted, these are an existing concept in our tariff and market. These are costs associated with the extensive maintenance of a generating unit that cannot be done as part of routine maintenance. These costs must be associated with electrical production of the generating unit such that the cost can be related to run-hour production or the startup of a generating unit. And finally, we have other maintenance costs. These are maintenance costs which do not require the generator to undergo an extensive outage and may be characterized as fixed or variable. So currently, we issued a report in 2018 showing BOM costs for some of these storage and other NGR-type resources. Fuel cells was quite high at $37 per megawatt hour, and batteries, as I noted, were valued at $0 per megawatt hour. An important thing to remember about this is that NGR resources currently do not have VOM or MMA adders in our market, as they do not have default energy bids or commitment costs in our market. A note, DEBs for these NGR resources are being considered in the energy storage and distributed energy resources stakeholder process, which we can go into a bit later. So at this point, we'd like to open the call up for comments on our definitions as they relate to these storage resources, as well as thoughts on estimated values that we discussed. Please keep in mind we're having a separate working group on Friday about hydro resources, which will include pumped hydro resources as well. So please identify yourself if you'd like to weigh in. Thank you for your time.
And again, the phone lines are open, so feel free to speak up.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Great. This is Alvis Svoboda at PG&E. Just a couple of clarifying questions for you. One is, so the NGRs have the peculiarity that they can, their dispatch curve goes into the negative as well as the positive range. Would a VOM cost essentially be an adder to only the discharge side of the range? Is that sort of specified as part of the definition here?
Well, currently, VOM adders are only incorporated in the market via default energy bids, and these types of resources do not have default energy bids. So at the moment,
understood. But I'm just saying, in concept, how would you see setting aside the ESDR initiative for a moment, and just because you did do and my other question basically had to do with how the Nexen report arrived at its calculation of the $0 value. But I think the aim here, I mean, a number of the resource types that you're dealing with in this initiative don't have default energy bids, or they're never used because they're essentially fixed schedule resources. So we're trying to get at what's the appropriate value, and I think you're doing a great job here of getting at definitions. So I did want to just sort of get at those two questions. One, how did you get at the $0 value, and then also, if there were a non-zero value, let's suppose there were a non-zero value, would you then, the definition essentially make clear that this applied only on the discharge side, or would you consider it to automatically apply on the charge side somehow as well?
Gotcha. Thanks for clarifying.
Sure, thanks.
I think conceptually, yes, the discharge side would be the side that we would be considering, because these are related to generation, which is analogous to the discharge component that you spoke of. But again, we'll defer to the ESDR team on that. But thanks for bringing that up, and we welcome any other participants' thoughts on that as well. Your second question, how Nexen arrived at their report. Nexen was focused on primarily considering VOM costs as consumables, and when they looked at battery resources, they didn't see any consumables that would be consumed on a dollar per megawatt basis.
Okay.
When they were arriving at that value.
Okay, for the particular battery technologies that they were considering, there wouldn't be any. What about the, so was there any consideration of maintenance costs, or, I mean, it's sort of common knowledge that battery lifetime can be affected by how hard a battery is operated, and one would expect in general that kind of consideration would be reflected here somewhere, like in the maintenance cost. There could be, for example, a variable, depending on how much energy is generated from the battery or how frequently it's used, there could be a change in the maintenance of the resource that could lead to increased cost. Is that sort of encompassed in the Nexen study at all?
I don't believe it was covered in the Nexen study, but we'd very much be interested in hearing what types of activities, what types of maintenance activities just in general take place at battery facilities, and how you could see those relating to a dollar per megawatt adder, or separately something along the lines of dollar per run hour or per start. Do you see those going into which category? I would be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is really folklore in my mind, because we're in a different. We're not. And there may be people with lithium ion on the call, but we do have some coming in, and the understanding is that there's there would be at least two kinds of issues. One is, depending on how many hours of discharge you do, you will have to essentially replace components of the battery, or potentially the entire battery, sooner than the planned lifetime of the battery. So essentially one model would be that you have to replace modules essentially depending on how hard the battery is run. And so that might be one kind of maintenance, essentially, that the battery's being kept at its original capabilities by having components replaced. And folklore is that does depend on the total discharge that's occurred at a battery. The other, which was presented actually by, I thought it was presented by CAISO in the ESDR initiative, was that it was in the Department of Market Monitoring's consideration that they discussed the idea that depending on how deeply a battery discharges, the lifetime of the battery would be significantly affected as well. And so essentially, if you're running it in a relatively shallow cycling regime, the battery lifetime could be much longer than if it's being cycled fully from minimum to maximum charge frequently. So both of those, I think, would come under that heading, because they would affect the lifetime of the battery.
Hey, Alva. This is Gabe Murtaugh from Policy Team, and as you noted, I am working on that ESDR initiative, and in that initiative, we're thinking about how to capture the costs for storage resources, specifically for use in a default energy bid. And I think, kind of exactly like you said, you've hit on some things there that are relevant to that discussion and perhaps have some overlap in this discussion as well. So I think, you know, the concepts that you were talking about, how those costs are incurred, are on track and following with what our understanding is as well. So we have to go for, I suppose. But I think one question that might be outstanding that this call raises is whether some of those costs, you know, perhaps should be covered in the variable operations and maintenance, or, you know, if we are making a specific default energy bid for storage resources that doesn't include a variable operations and maintenance, how these costs are included in the DEB per se. And currently we were sort of more going down the path of, you know, these custom replacement costs being specific for individual resources rather than being a blanket value that's applied to all the resources, which would be more akin to like variable operations and maintenance costs that we're talking about in this meeting. But I think there certainly is room for discussion sort of in both camps. So we'd be interested to hear any feedback on that as well.
Well, I mean, I think there's some, just as with, you know, these variable VOM costs for thermal units are not being captured with perfect accuracy by a single value, obviously. I think there's some reason to have the CAISO setting a sort of a base value, and just to thinking about a battery, for example, if you're in an environment where, for example, the charging costs were zero because it's always being charged with free solar energy in the middle of the day, then the only cost that could reasonably be represented for the default energy bid would be some wear and tear due in discharge, because they're essentially getting their fuel for free in that case, but there's still there's an opportunity cost element too. But let's just assume talking about daily cycling and the opportunity costs are essentially going to be correctly determined by CAISO in the market, then you do want to have a floor in terms of what you can discharge at, which would be kind of that wear and tear cost. So I think there's still some reason to think about a base value that everybody can have confidence in, and then you know, that the default energy bid is not going to go below that level if that's a characteristic of the vast majority of batteries. Now, I know, like, flow batteries may not have the same consideration. I don't know what the mix is going to look like, but my understanding right now is that our, you know, sodium sulfur batteries like ours or flow batteries are just going to be a very tiny component of the battery portfolio for a while. And so I would encourage you to think about some base that would make it easy for new entrants to be able to, you know they'll be able to have a default energy bid, and that they can then perhaps refine it, you know, based on the data that they have. You know, like you say, maybe their costs are higher, then they would be able to come to you and explain that.
Great, yeah, thanks for weighing in. That's really helpful, and it's good to hear how you're thinking about it as well.
Thank you.
Anyone else like to weigh in?
This is Michael from APS Public Service, Arizona Public Service. With the NGRs, do you have a particular preference with either using the variable operation maintenance adders, the major maintenance adder, or even a DEB? Kind of to the last gentleman's point, the technology is divergent. If you're talking a nickel cadmium compared to nickel metal hydride, of how many times you can cycle a unit, how the depth of discharge and even the state of charge will proportionally change how the market cycles it. Even the recharge cycles, if you are looking at potentially having an inverted or some kind of negative value for when you are charging the unit compared to discharging, there has to be a proper way to account unit by unit. If you're saying nickel compared to lithium, ferrous phosphate, one of these batteries, is going to have a very different modeling. So is there a preference for how the CAISO is looking for us to model these?
I don't think we have a direct preference, but maybe you could weigh in on whether you think they're more accurately, these costs are incurred more accurately on a dollar per megawatt hour, which would fall into, well, dollar per megawatt hour versus dollar per run hour or dollar per kind of charge. It seems that it would fall most conceptually into the last, which would be analogous to our dollar per start NMA. What do you think on that?
It almost has to be a dynamic variance between the state of the battery. Again, if the battery is current depth of discharge near 100% capacity versus 50% depth of discharge, you're going to have a very different price curve associated to this. So it has to be almost dynamic to adapt to, are you starting the unit during a temporary price spike that would halt us from charging, and the depth of discharge and number of cycles, if we're going to bring the unit completely down for the full duration of peak, that's going to change our ability to recover some of those variable costs. And as well, the major maintenance adder of, are we needing to remove particular modules of these batteries and replace cells, and look to make sure the unit is operating within capacity and contractually as well.
Okay, any other comments?
Does anyone have anything to offer on the definitions that we offered on cost components and as they relate to these types of resources? Are they relevant, or are they more apt to, you know, the thermal units that we discussed and hydro that we will be discussing?
Hey, this is Mike.
Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Sorry, can you introduce yourself again?
Sorry, this is Mike Castellano from the Public Utilities Commission.
Oh, hi, Mike.
Hey, how's it going? So, you know, the cost definitions that you have up there are, you know, kind of straightforward, you know, things that are easy to track, and I'm not sure that there's necessarily a problem with those, but I think the problem comes, and I think it's similar with the DEBs, the way you guys want to kind of fit storage into the same categories of operation and the same pattern of operation that you use for thermal units isn't necessarily the best way to do it. And, you know, I think getting into some of this, you know, do these costs seem more like major maintenance costs or more like variable operations costs? You know, sure, there are some that probably track kind of closely with major maintenance costs, but you guys right now I don't think have a way where you really track run hours of batteries, because I don't know if you have a, you know, if they don't have a commitment cost and they don't have a PMIN, you're not going to track whether or not, you don't have a really accurate way to track whether or not they're committed, or for how long they're committed, or exactly what they're doing in relation to that. And I think, you know, I also think the DEB effort, sort of trying to establish a single price where you're going to tell these guys to charge or discharge based on some expectation of future prices or whatever they're talking about in there now, is not the best, is not really representative of how storage resources need to look at the market to operate profitably. I think, you know, in addition to the DEB situation, and now this sort of, you know, costs might be structured significantly differently for a storage resource in relation to output than for a thermal resource in relation to output, sort of pushes the idea that we really need a new model for how storage resources are going to participate in the CAISO markets.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for those comments. This is Gabe again. I think your comments that you just made are relevant, and I think the ISO has actually evolved its thinking a little bit in ESDR. In the most recent workshop, we presented some ideas about actually tracking sort of more along the lines of those variable costs rather than kind of using the methodology we put out in our initial straw proposal that's sort of more outlined, focusing on cycles and predicting prices in the future, that sort of methodology. So I think that's a good point, and we sort of have moved away from that thinking. The other thing that we've noted, and I think this goes back to Alva's comments and the gentleman from APS, but run hours for batteries may be one characteristic that drives prices for resources. From the literature that we've seen, it seems like depth of discharge is actually perhaps the primary driver of those costs. So we're currently sort of working on an idea sort of around depth of discharge and potentially using that to determine market outcomes and actual variable prices for these things. But that's still sort of developing as we move forward.
Okay. Have you read our comments on ESDR?
I have not read the comments on ESDR yet, but that is on my list to do, and I will.
They're really good.
Mike, I'm looking forward to that. You just made my day there.
Any other comments, questions?
This is Alva again. I just want to say Mike's comment about the effect of run hours is a really good one when looking at the current NGR model, is that there is no, run hours is not a meaningful thing to associate costs with in the current market model for a battery because it is running at all times. I mean, it can provide spin when it's at zero, and so there is no concept of commitment. And so anything that is, that may still be an actual source of cost, but it sort of by definition, it can't be part of the variable cost of operations. So I think your emphasis on variable cost of operations is the right direction to be looking in terms of these kinds of values. Same thing with MMA. It's not going to directly translate into anything that would be a variable in the market. So it may be a meaningful cost, but it's not going to be capturable in the market anyway. So, but some of the future technologies like flow batteries, that may be a different issue. I gather that there are some meaningful changes of state with flow batteries, and so that might actually still be something to be considered for some future technologies. I don't know about be interested in hearing more from the gentleman from APS about the nickel chemistry, and it sounds like it has some interesting variations on the lithium-ion constraints.
Anyone from APS want to respond?
Would you be able to repeat the question? This was another engineer was asking. You're discussing this in parallel.
Oh, okay. I was just very interested in your. I mean, maybe it's just something to take offline, but I think having a description of what the kind of variable costs applying to the nickel chemistry are, it sounds like they're somewhat different from the lithium-ion, and be good information for this kind of setting where essentially the ISO is trying to come up with a generic model that will apply for a while to different kinds of NGR resources that might come along.
Of course, we would want to essentially take this conversation offline because the charging characteristics as well as discharge characteristics when you're comparing nickel cadmium anhydride compared to lithium ion to ferrous phosphate are significantly different. And even as we're planning resource acquisition and others, that is a topic we could talk on in greater detail going forward to make sure everything from modular battery replacement and major maintenance, any kind of hurdle rates will be properly accounted for.
I think it'd be great to hear some of that in the ESDR context, maybe.
Yes, that's a parallel conversation. Sorry for the distracting conversation we're having over here.
All right.
All good. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other comments?
Okay. Well, we'll just move on to our next steps. And in a way, this is a good transition. We'd like you guys to get a chance, if you haven't done so already, to review the materials found on the ESDR Stakeholder Process website. We've included a link here, as well as to participate in that initiative. If you'd like to submit any comments as it relates to this conversation, please send your emails to the email address listed here by 7:30. And if you'd like your comments to be confidential, please note that in your submission. We can keep those internal or otherwise, if you'd like them to be public, we can do that as well. Thank you for your participation today. I'm going to turn it over to Christina.
Yeah, just quickly before we end, we are going to provide a comments template specific to storage resources that will be out on that variable operations and maintenance cost review webpage, where you'll also find the recording. The recording should be available later this week, and also the other materials related to this process. So what we'll do is once we create that comments template, we'll go ahead and email it out to everybody that participated in the call today. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.